Good evening, dear listeners, and welcome back to our scary stories. I'm your host, weaving threads of terror into the fabric of your darkest nightmares. Tonight, we've unearthed a tale so haunting, it could very well alter the boundaries of your reality. A story of mystery, madness, and mirrors. But be warned, this tale may reflect something about you that you'd rather not see. Are you ready to journey into the abyss? Buckle up, my friends, because tonight, we're delving into the Forgotten Room. A gust of wind echoed through the skeletal branches of ancient, gnarled trees that loomed over a remote mansion. Its windows, like countless vacant eyes, seemed to regard David with a cold indifference as he stared up at the dilapidated structure. The air was heavy with the musty aroma of long-forgotten memories and decay. David, a rugged man in his mid-30s with an unkempt beard and deep-set eyes, had driven hours through winding country roads to reach this place. The old Thompson Place, as locals called it, was legendary among urban explorers and thrill-seekers. For David, it was a siren call, a deep hum in his soul he couldn't ignore. He reached into his weathered backpack, pulling out a sturdy flashlight and a camera that had seen better days. The flashlight flickered to life, casting an orb of light that sliced through the mansion's overwhelming darkness. He felt a sense of adventure rush over him, a childlike giddiness. Stepping across the threshold, a wave of cold air greeted him, as if the mansion were taking its first breath in years. The flooring beneath creaked like the bones of some old giant as David treaded carefully. His eyes took a moment to adjust to the darkness, then gradually began to make out the contours of the grand hall, worn-out Persian rugs, shattered porcelain vases, and time-worn portraits of people who seemed almost accusatory in their gaze. The mansion seemed to swallow all sound, rendering his footsteps unnervingly muted. The air felt thick, and he tasted the stale, forgotten years with each inhalation. As he moved deeper, the atmosphere grew oppressive, like walking through a heavy mist. David couldn't shake the feeling that the mansion was aware of him, that it watched, judged, and perhaps hungered. His flashlight beam danced across the ceiling, illuminating chandeliers encased in cobwebs that appeared like grotesque sculptures in a twisted art gallery. A door to his left caught his attention, partially hidden by an antique bookshelf filled with mold-eaten books. As if led by an invisible hand, David moved the heavy bookshelf aside, revealing the hidden room. Heart pounding in his chest, he cautiously stepped inside. The room was almost entirely empty, save for one hauntingly beautiful object, an antique mirror framed in intricately carved mahogany. Unlike everything else in the mansion, the mirror was pristine, free of dust and cobwebs. It was as if time itself had refused to lay a finger on it. David aimed his flashlight at the mirror. What he saw froze him in place. The reflection did not show the room he was in. Instead, it unveiled a vision of a torture chamber populated by devices whose functions were chillingly evident: hooks, saws, and other instruments of torment. Chains dangled from the ceiling, and a worn wooden chair, studded with cruel-looking restraints, stood ominously at the chamber's center. His grip tightened around the flashlight, every fiber of his being screaming at him to leave, to run. But something deeper, a burning curiosity mingled with dread, held him captive. He touched the surface of the mirror with a trembling hand. The cold glass seemed to pulse beneath his fingers, and for a split second, he swore he heard faint, muffled cries of agony emanate from the depths of the glass. In that room, surrounded by a darkness so complete it felt like a living entity, David finally understood. This mirror wasn't just a window to another reality, it was a doorway. And as his eyes met his own twisted reflection in the torture chamber, he realized that some doors are meant to stay closed. Gripped by a fascination he couldn't entirely explain, David approached the antique mirror once again. Its mahogany frame seemed almost sentient, as if whispering secrets etched through time. Slowly, hesitantly, he stretched his hand toward its icy surface. He felt the hair on his arms stand up, as if charged by some invisible energy. The moment his fingers made contact with the glass, a strange shiver coursed through his body. It was an almost electric sensation, and he watched, breathless, as his reflection in the torture chamber mimicked his movements. The chains hanging from the ceiling of the reflected room trembled. The rusty hooks swayed ever so slightly. David took a staggering step back. Is this even real? He muttered, suddenly questioning his sanity. Maybe the dank, oppressive air of the mansion had finally gotten to him. Maybe this was a hallucination, some trick of the light and shadow. Just then, a blood-curdling sound emanated from the mirror, a low moan tinged with the unbearable agony of countless souls. The room temperature plummeted, each exhalation materializing into visible breath. David's heart pounded in his chest, as though trying to escape. His eyes widened as he saw a small object shimmer into existence on the floor beside the mirror. It was a rusted, twisted nail, its origin unmistakable. It had come from the torture chamber, now lying there as tangible as the dread filling the room. David felt as if an icy hand had clenched his stomach. His dread intensified, becoming an all-consuming force. His prior thoughts of the room's mustiness, of the mansion's unsettling aura, all paled in comparison. He understood now that he had activated something horrendous, something that defied the natural laws of the world. The mirror was not merely a reflective surface, but a gateway, certainly between dimensions, perhaps between realities altogether. Even the air felt tainted, imbued with an almost palpable malevolence. The scent of rust and decay seemed to grow stronger, making each breath a labor. His flashlight flickered, as if struggling to hold onto its life, before stabilizing into a feeble glow. Feeling as if he were teetering on the precipice of an abyss, David knew he had to leave. With one last glance at the mirror, its haunting reflection a tableau of horrors, he turned on his heels and bolted for the door. Yet, as he gripped the tarnished doorknob and stepped back into the dark corridor, David knew deep down that leaving the room physically meant little. For the door he had opened in his mind, much like the accursed mirror, could never be fully closed again. David's boots crunched gravel as he made his way hastily from the mansion, his pulse still reverberating like an unsung hymn of dread. He felt an immense relief as the mansion shrank in his rearview mirror, its towering facade appearing almost like a monument to the unreal. Despite the unsettling events, David found himself unable to let go. His mind raced as he drove into the small, sleepy town, its atmosphere starkly contrasting the looming dread he felt. He needed answers, something to root his experiences in logic and reason. The local library, a quaint, two-story building, seemed like a promising starting point. A bell chimed as David walked into the library, the smell of aged paper filling the air. With each step, his shoes thudded softly against the worn-out carpet. Navigating through the maze of bookshelves, he finally located the section on local history. His fingers skimmed through the dusty spines until a title caught his eye, Forgotten Legacies, a chronicle of the unexplained. Flipping through its yellowed pages, David discovered an account about the mansion, once owned by the enigmatic Thompson family, who were known for their interest in occult practices. The family had disappeared suddenly, leaving behind only rumors, and a sprawling mansion filled with secrets. One passage stood out, detailing their possession of an ancient mirror believed to be a gateway to other dimensions, perhaps even infernal ones. A chill ran down David's spine. The Thompsons had dabbled in dangerous knowledge, and the mirror was said to be cursed, blending realities in its cruel reflections. The text suggested that the family's sudden disappearance was directly linked to their tampering with dimensions beyond human understanding. David closed the book, feeling a mixture of fear and a morbid fascination that gnawed at his rationality. Against his better judgment, he found himself driving back to the mansion. The imposing structure seemed to loom even larger than before, as if mocking his return. Steeling himself, he climbed the grand staircase, his flashlight slicing through the pervasive darkness. He arrived at the hidden room, hesitating briefly before stepping inside. The mirror stood there, untouched, its reflected room appearing even more malevolent than before. As David stared into the reflection, he noticed something change. A thick mist began to seep out of the mirror, accompanied by a low growl. Before he could react, the mist solidified into chains, identical to those in the reflected torture chamber, now hanging ominously from the ceiling of the actual room. His heart thundering in his chest, David saw more objects materialize. A rusted saw, a hook, and what looked like an archaic mask with grotesque features. These objects were no longer confined to the reflected world. They had invaded his reality. David felt as though he were sinking, his senses drowned in an atmosphere filled with the odors of sulfur and decay. A heavy realization settled over him. These realities weren't just bleeding into each other, they were merging. And in that terrible moment, as the room seemed to close in on him, David understood that he was now part of something far more horrifying than he had ever imagined. Even before it materialized, David sensed its presence, a malignancy in the very air he breathed. The room darkened inexplicably, as though light itself were retreating from this new abomination. From the foggy veil of the mirror, a form began to coalesce. It was not entirely physical, yet its malevolence was as real as the trembling fear it elicited from David's core. The entity was a monstrous distortion of reality, its shape like a nightmare poorly remembered, its contours pulsating as if undecided between various forms of horror. Floating in the air, the entity seemed to survey its new dominion. The objects from the torture chamber, now material in this world, quivered as if in reverence to their master. Desperation surged through David. His gaze darted to a heavy antique chair beside him, and he lunged for it. With all his might, he hurled the chair at the mirror, aiming to shatter the accursed glass and, hopefully, the twisted reality it brought forth. But the moment the chair connected, it bounced off the surface as if repelled by an invisible force. The mirror remained unscathed, its mocking reflection only growing darker. The entity laughed, a sound like grinding stones that filled the room, clawing at David's sanity. It moved closer, and as it did, it seemed to pull from the very fabric of his thoughts. Memories, fears, and traumas played before him like a grotesque theater. His most shameful moments, his deepest insecurities, and the faces of those he had wronged seemed to parade before him, each glance from the entity twisting the knife deeper into his psychological wounds. David felt like he was crumbling under the unbearable weight of his own consciousness. It was then that a fleeting memory surfaced, something he had read in the library about the mirror. A vague line about the mirror's curse being reversible under certain unutterable conditions. What could be so unspeakable that it was reduced to mere insinuation in a book about the unexplained? Mustering every ounce of mental strength, David tried to focus, to tune out the emotional tempest the entity was subjecting him to. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small vial of salt, commonly used in various occult practices for purification. With a shaking hand, he began to draw a circle around the mirror, chanting words of containment he'd picked up from his vast readings on the supernatural. As he completed the circle and uttered the final word, the room trembled. The entity howled as if subjected to an unbearable pain, its form quivering and distorting even more erratically. The mirror's reflection flickered, showing not the torture chamber, but brief glimpses of the room as it should be. It was a fleeting victory and a thin sliver of hope. Yet, as David stood there, his eyes meeting his own panicked reflection, he understood that the mirror and the malevolent reality it connected to were not defeated, only momentarily held at bay. And so, there in the room of dust and cobwebs, where realities bled and horrors unfathomable came to life, David felt the enormity of the battle that lay ahead. A battle not just against twisted realities, but also the darkness within himself. A plan began to crystallize in David's mind, as fragile as spun glass, but as vital as the very air he breathed. He remembered an old belief that reflections were not just mere images, but had their own realms of existence. If the mirror was a gateway, then his reflection could perhaps be manipulated to act in the mirrored room. His plan hinged on the tenuous belief that what he did before the mirror, his reflection could replicate in the torture chamber. With this in mind, David reached into his backpack and pulled out an antique dagger, an artifact he borrowed from the local library's restricted section. It was said to be a relic tied to the mansion's twisted past, a tool used in arcane rituals. He held the dagger aloft, a glint of steely resolve lighting his eyes. The entity focused on him, as if sensing his intentions. A low, rumbling growl filled the room, oppressive like a heavy mist. The dagger trembled in David's hands as he tightened his grip. He drew it back, whispering ancient words he'd gleaned from esoteric texts. For a moment, it felt like the world held its breath. David drove the dagger into the air before the mirror, simultaneously uttering a final incantation. A strange, stifled scream emanated from the entity. Its form shimmered as if losing focus. It writhed in agony, the effect of the ancient artifact creating a temporary chink in its malevolent armor. Seizing the opportunity, David hastily positioned himself before the mirror. He could now see his reflection mimicking his every move, but in the background of that reflection was not his room. It was the torture chamber. With quick, deliberate motions, David's reflection maneuvered through the chamber toward a gruesome lever, a mechanism that, in this perverse world, served as a means to activate the torture devices. David felt a sickening wave of dread at the realization of his reflection's intent, but he steeled himself and pulled. A sound like ripping fabric resonated through the room as the reflected torture chamber rattled and shook. The entity let out a shrill scream, its form losing coherence, fracturing into tendrils of dark mist. The objects from the chamber that had materialized in David's world started to vanish, dissolving into clouds of ash. With a final pull, David's reflection threw the lever to its last setting. A mirrored room collapsed upon itself, a swirl of vanishing darkness. The entity, unable to maintain its form, was sucked into the imploding chamber, its scream a fading echo in the corners of the room. David fell to his knees, his breath ragged, his body soaked in sweat. The mirror now reflected just the room, barren and somehow more desolate in its normalcy. It was over, or so it seemed. But as he looked closer, he noticed that his reflection looked back at him not with relief, but with a knowing, weary glance. It was as if it was aware of the hellish ordeal and the narrow escape from a malevolent reality. As David left the room, sealing the door behind him, he couldn't shake off the realization that the gateway might be closed, but the mirror, its glass now as mundane as it was deceptive, still held a sliver of another world, another reality where unspeakable horrors lurked, waiting for another moment of weakness, another crack in the veneer of reality. And though he was leaving the room would never entirely leave him. The entity was gone, but David knew that the battle was far from over. For within the depths of the mirror, and within the dark recesses of his own soul, shadows lingered, shadows that were patient, insidious, and eternal. David stared at the mirror one final time. His eyes were bloodshot, and the tension that had knotted his shoulders for what felt like an eternity had somewhat loosened. The mirror was innocuous once more, showing the empty, decaying room behind him. Yet he felt no victory, no triumph, only a cold, lingering dread. Snapping his camera shut, David let out a sigh that seemed to have been building up for ages. He packed his remaining gear, the life-giving flashlight, the artifact he had used to fight off the monstrous entity, and the camera filled with photos that told a tale no one would ever believe. No one should ever set foot in here again, he muttered as he pulled a small notebook from his bag and scribbled down his experience, hiding it under a loose floorboard near the entrance. A breadcrumb for any future explorers, cautioning them where maps and rumors would not. With a last, lingering glance, he shut the heavy, creaking door behind him and made his way out of the mansion. The air outside was crisp, filling his lungs like a rejuvenating elixir. The sky, tinged with the soft hues of twilight, seemed to offer a promise of a life beyond these cursed walls, a life David was eager to reclaim. As he drove away, the mansion's haunting visage receded in the rearview mirror until it was nothing but a dark smudge against the dying light of the day. Yet his mind was a swirl of contemplation. What is reality but a fragile layer separating us from unimaginable terror? Could one ever confidently understand the boundaries of existence when such boundaries could be frayed and torn by things beyond comprehension? Finally back at home, David unloaded his gear and sat at his computer to upload the photos. Maybe, just maybe, there was evidence to corroborate his unbelievable experience. He clicked through the images one by one, the haunting scenes rekindling his memories of dread and desperation. Then he reached the last picture, a photo of the now inert mirror. His heart froze. He couldn't believe his eyes. The reflection in the mirror was empty, devoid of his figure that should have been front and center. His thoughts raced, colliding with each other in a mad dance of panic and disbelief. If the mirror was a gateway to another reality, and his reflection was absent, what part of him, what essential fragment of his soul or consciousness, might still be lingering in that nightmarish realm? As he stared at the screen, the room around him seemed to contract, as if tightening around him in a malevolent embrace. He understood now that the gateway may be closed, but some doors, once opened, never fully shut. Something had been irrevocably changed, fractured. As he pondered the twisted, unfathomable nature of the universe, a sense of dread settled over him, bone deep and chilling. David could leave the mansion, drive miles away, and bury the memories under the daily grind of ordinary life. Yet, no distance could ever separate him from the abominable knowledge he now carried. That somewhere, in a room hidden behind the layers of reality, a part of him remained, a part that would forever stare into the abyss of another world, into the heart of darkness itself. Ah, back so soon. It seems you've survived our jaunt into the unspeakable, for better or worse. But don't get too comfortable, you never really leave the forgotten room, do you? While you tuck yourself in tonight, remember, the terrors we unearth in our stories may be mere reflections of the horrors hidden within us all. If you dare to listen again, we'll be here, lurking in the shadows of your thoughts. Until then, dear listeners, may your mirrors always show your reflection, and nothing more. This is our Scary Stories signing off for tonight.